All right, well, thank you for this opportunity. I'm Matt Jones from the Arctic Data Center. We're a recently funded data center from Mark Stieglitz is our program officer at NSF. We have the mission of basically providing a home and an archive for data that's coming out of NSF-funded Arctic research across a wide variety of disciplines. And I wanted to take a few minutes to just kind of run through some of the data and features of the Arctic Data Center that will be relevant to building this carbon budget. So I'll start by just mentioning that the Arctic Data Center itself is a collaboration between us at NCEAS, the National Center for Environmental Information at NOAA, and the Data One network of data repositories. And so a lot of this work that I'll talk about comes from a wide variety of those collaborators. If you look at the Arctic Data Center today, there's about 4,400 data sets archived there in a little over half a million data files. That represents the work of about 1,900 different investigators that have contributed data over multiple decades. Many or most of those data, about 3,500 of them, originated with our predecessor, ADST, which was archiving data for over a decade before we came along. And so we're building upon a sort of corpus of information about the Arctic that's been building up over a long time. We have about 3,800 users that have recorded, accessing that data and downloading it over time, but the download records are definitely a minimum. We know that we haven't captured all of the downloads of all the data over time as we shifted from systems, but it's still a pretty sizable collection of data and really relevant to the Arctic. So I thought I'd spend a couple minutes kind of just going over some of the types of things that are available that are relevant to the carbon. Obviously, there's a wide variety of data types that can be used in building a carbon budget. One of them is net primary production, and here's a screenshot of a quick search looking for net primary production as a keyword. You'll see that you find 3 data sets that are pretty relevant. The first from John Hobby, it's a model output, basically about large scale ecosystem modeling for Toolik Lake. The second one I think is super relevant, right? Analysis of the carbon balance for the Arctic Basin from 1997 to 2006. If you take a look at that data set, you'll find that it's got a really nice synthesis across a large time span. They had, in that particular McGuire data set, they used a bunch of input data. It's hard necessarily to know exactly what, at this point, where those were from. So there's probably a wide variety of inputs to that. Same thing with the third data set here, this Chapin data set that's basically looking at carbon exchange at the forest transition. And that's, again, a long time series integration and kind of a modeling exercise. So, somebody's on with a muting your microphone. There we go. So when you're in the Arctic Data Center site, you can search for these data sets with a variety of different filters, searching for data attributes or for who created things, locations, and taxa. In general, you can subset down to things you're interested in. I thought I'd point out a few examples. One of the major features of the Arctic Data Center is that it's cross-disciplinary. We have data from a wide variety of different research areas. So here's a few that's probably of interest. This first one from Sarah Ludwig is on fire severity effects on nutrient dynamics, and they really quantified the effects of fire on mobilization of carbon, soil carbon, which I thought was relevant and interesting. There's a lot of data like the second one, the ocean example that I gave, which is basically survey data that quantifies methane releases in the Beaufort Sea. And then the third one, large scale and AON project, large scale project that's observing methane carbon dioxide fluxes throughout the Arctic. And that's a very large scale project, the SARES project. All 3 of these kind of illustrate that the carbon data that's in the Arctic Data Center comes at many different scales. The fire severity effects data set that I show there is really an experimental data set. at one particular time period, one particular scale, whereas the AN project is a much larger observational data set spanning a much larger space and temporal region. There's also data from historical data from, for example, paleological times. This I-score data set from McConnell that I've shown here, the D4 continuous I-score data, shows carbon dioxide and other relevant gas measurements throughout a much longer geological time period. There's a lot of I-score data that's registered with the Arctic Data Center and is available and useful, as well as a wide variety of model outputs. So there's a number of studies that take incoming empirical or observational data and then produce some sort of modeled assessment of carbon flow throughout the Arctic. So in this case, Terry Chapin put together a model assessing carbon exchange, I think largely focused around the boreal forest at the LTR site there in Alaska. So, the thing about all of these examples that I think is interesting from the Arctic Data Center perspective is that these are all collected by individually funded projects. They're not necessarily coordinated across projects. And so you might have many different groups that are collecting similar or the same types of data, but they're not necessarily doing it all in the same way. They each have their own unique and sometimes experimental methodologies. So this data is really useful for understanding, for example, mechanisms of carbon transport and carbon mobilization. But it's also going to be something that won't necessarily scale up to Arctic-wide. Some of the experiments are laboratory-based, some of them are going to be field-based, some of them will be large-scale observational things. So this wide variety of data, this sort of heterogeneity, is a hallmark of the kinds of projects that NSF funds, and that is represented and reflected in the data that we have in the Arctic Data Center. If you do a keyword search across the data center for a number of relevant things, you can see that there are a lot of data sets that are of relevance. Everything from carbon and carbon dioxide having many hundreds of data sets to things like fire and flux having a different set. These are probably an overlapping set of data sets. We can help whatever group is interested in conducting a much more targeted search. The user interface within the Arctic Data Center is kind of a generic search user interface that's targeting any user that might come from any discipline. But if you have a specific interest, like for example, really diving into carbon and carbon dioxide, there's a lot of more structured information that we could provide access to. And so we should have a discussion about how we would really want to search for and locate the data sets that are really of interest to a particular carbon balance. Brings me kind of sort of slide, which is that this issue of heterogeneity is a really complex one, and it is one that I think causes issues for discovery and integration of data across all of the data repositories that I'm aware of. So you have issues really with the use of terminology. Like if somebody uses the term litter, you might have multiple different concepts that come up, like as shown in these different pictures. But of course, none of those are the litter that we're really referring to. Litter we're talking about in this case would be leaf litter, and that is of relevance to carbon balance because it has to do with biomass production and movement of carbon in the ecosystem. So we've been embarking on a project within our larger data federation, within the Data One Federation, to try to understand how to standardize terminology and the use of terminology to characterize measurements within these heterogeneous data sets. So when you have different groups, for example, these two different studies at Harvard Forest and Andrews Forest that both are looking at detritus, how you would really be able to discover and know that these different data sets are similar or the same. And the way we're doing that is by creating a controlled vocabulary. This one's called EXO, which is the ecosystem ontology, to really build a standardized set of terminology for characterizing measurements, and in this case, particularly related to carbon flow. And so in this case, we might have two data sets, each of them contain leaf litter measurements, and we want to make sure that we characterize those measurements as applying to, for example, the leaf litter carbon pool. So I'd be happy to talk with people about this work on semantic classification of data. It's definitely an early process, but it's one that I think is really necessary to scale up discovery and integration of data for these kinds of integrative studies like we're talking about with the carbon budget. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that the Arctic Data Center is part of the larger Data One Federation, which is a federation of repositories that have agreed to work together to build an interoperable system so that each repository isn't a standalone and separate organization, but instead they share protocols and share software systems so that it makes it easier for them to maintain their systems, but also it makes it easier for researchers to discover data that might be sitting in multiple different repositories around the country. So there are other members of the Data One Federation, other than the Arctic Data Center, that will hold a lot of data that are relevant to the carbon balance in the Arctic. So the National Centers for Environmental Information at NCI at NOAA will definitely have a bunch of relevant information. The International Arctic Research Center at Fairbanks is a member. The LTR network is a member. There are a wide variety of others. I looked through the list. There's probably about 8 or 10 different repositories that are part of that Data One network that would all hold relevant information for this carbon balance project. So with that, thanks. And I guess I'll pass the torch over to the next speaker.